So last week, India and the United Kingdom agreed to sign a trade deal. Now, this isn't just any trade deal. It's the biggest bilateral pact of the UK with any country post-Brexit. And it has been a long time coming. Let me explain both. Now, the deal is expected to boost UK's GDP by £4.8 billion and its annual wages by £2.2 billion in the long term. Bilateral trade between the two countries is projected to rise by £25.5 billion per year, with £15.7 billion coming from increased UK exports to India. Remember that in 2024, India was the UK's 12th largest trading partner, with total trade between the two countries totaling £43 billion. So, the potential and willingness for this is huge. In fact, according to a recent report by Grant Thornton, 42% of UK firms that are not in India plan to make a market entry into the country. And 96% of companies that are already in India aim to expand operations. Now, the key point of the trade deal is, of course, lower tariffs. So, India will, in a phased manner, cut or eliminate tariffs on 90% of tariff lines, covering 92% of UK exports to India. In fact, because of these cuts, UK's exporters will save between £400 million to £900 million annually in tariff reductions. Which sectors will benefit from these lower tariffs? Automotives, medical devices, cosmetics, whiskies, gin, and soft drinks. Take the example of whiskey. Tariff on the beverage, that's India's tariff levied on UK's whiskey, is now 150%. That will immediately halve to 75% once the deal is signed, and then to 40% in the next 10 years. Car tariffs, now 100%, will reduce to 10%, with separate quotas for ICE vehicles, EVs, and hybrids. Cosmetics and perfumes, tariffs now at 10 to 20%, will be halved or removed completely over a decade. The deal also ensures that UK's companies in the telecom, insurance, and legal sectors get more market access in India. And this one's really interesting. UK firms will now qualify to compete in India's £500 billion public procurement market under local sourcing norms, which means British firms can now compete for Indian government projects. And what does India get? Also lower tariffs, more UK products, market access to the UK, and something it's been vying for a very, very long time. Something called the Social Security Agreement that ensures that employees moving between the UK and India and their employers will only be liable to pay social security contributions in one country at a time, rather than paying in both countries as is the norm now. And why has the deal taken so long to come to fruition? Well, multiple reasons, including Brexit, 3 prime ministerial changes in the UK, a lot of to and fro over access to sectors such as banking, over IPs and copyrights, over India's demands for worker mobility, over India's concerns around data security, and of course, loads of haggling on tariffs. So in this episode, we will dig deeper into what the deal means for the two partners. Are all concerns resolved on both sides? And can a successful execution of this trade deal serve as a blueprint for the ones coming up? Primarily, India's planned agreement with the US. Listen on, it's Friday, the 9th of May. I'm your host Anirban Chowdhury, and this is the Morning Brief. My guest today is Pallavi Bakhru, partner and UK corridor leader at Grant Thornton Bharat. Hi, Pallavi. Very warm welcome to the morning brief. So glad you could make time.
Thank you, Anirban. Pleasure to be here and talking to you.
Right. Pleasure is absolutely mine. So, we are talking about this pretty significant India UK trade deal that both countries have now come into sort of an agreement upon. Now, this deal has been in the works for very long. I think, the first time that it was discussed was way back in 2004, long before Brexit had happened, etc. It has had more than 14 formal rounds of negotiations. In between, there have been political shuffles, especially in the UK, which saw 3 PMs. Apart from all this, why has it taken so long to fructify?
I think there's been a multitude of reasons. One clearly has been the elections at their end. They've seen a change of government. They've gone through, I think, 3 or 4 prime ministers. We've seen a very significant election in our country in 2024. So these are not easy negotiations. I mean, just to give you some more color on this, India, for example, is very fussed on rules of origin. How is the carbon border tax going to play out? UK had its own set of agenda in terms of, IPR, investor state dispute settlement issues. So these are all intricate issues, and navigating through these is not easy. And both countries also need to protect their own interests. So I think it's been a multitude of reasons. It's been geopolitical tensions, whereby your national priorities change periodically. But I think it's the impending US tariff that are going to be imposed, which I think has probably given a little bit of a nudge to India and UK to quickly sign up, the FTA, because they are the 5th and 6th largest economies. India is the 5th largest, and UK is the 6th largest economy. So it just makes sense for them to have a free trade agreement that allows both the economies to access each other.
Understood. Let's quickly come to the deal. Basic question. 3 biggest benefits that will be derived by the UK and by India, respectively, as a result of this.
I think as far as UK is concerned, I think it's the reduction of tariff on some of their key exports. Interestingly, the most significant one is Scotch whiskey. So we're not talking about, 10%, 20%. We're talking about very, very high rates of reduction in tariffs. So one was, of course, the tariff reduction to be able to grow the market. I think the second thing was access to Indian talent and skilled workers. Anybody who's familiar with the UK economy will know that they have been struggling since Brexit. You walk around the streets of London, you'll find there are stores that have shuttered. There are restaurants that are working at, a quarter of their capacity because they don't have, servers and things like that. So there is clearly a need for talent and workers, both. And then I think it's also to take away their reliance on the EU supply chain and to some extent their reliance on China. So I think it's a combination of these 3 things which I feel will benefit the UK economy hugely. And they're trying to make sure there's more money in the hands of the people and the economy does better.
Understood. So just talking about the UK's side of the deal, one thing that I found really interesting was that UK firms will now be able to compete in India's public procurement market, which I understand as the fact that the firms will probably be able to bid for government projects. How do you see this?
I think this is a really big one. And one will have to see the fine print in terms of how this happens, because we all know that, when it comes to public tenders, and government is one of the biggest spenders in any economy, there is always a local component, which in India we call it the Make in India or Anirban Bharat, either of these schemes. So I'm sure there will be some level of localization that will creep into these bids. But having said that, it is estimated that, this is a 38 billion pound business that now the UK businesses will have access to. So it's really big. It's really big from a potential perspective. But I think it's also worth talking about couple of things that the FTA talks about and some things that UK government has been, if I may say so, a little particular about. And that's something called anti-corruption.
Right.
They have a complete chapter on the document which is around anti-corruption. And this is largely because they have a very strong anti-bribery act in the UK.
Mm-hmm.
And which sort of is equally applicable to UK businesses working in India or their subsidiaries working in India. So I think it's going to be very good for the government procurement business also to suddenly come up with this level of transparency, this, level of fairness in how they deal. So while we are giving access to them, I'm sure it'll also make our procurement processes a lot more robust. And I think the second advantage that I see from an India perspective is our ability to partner with them on certain strategic services. I mean, if you typically look at it, government normally, the large tenders are usually for infrastructure, they are for defense, they're for healthcare, and more recently, clean energy because of all the commitments that India has made toward net zero and all of that, carbon net zero. So in a way, if it's handled well, I think this being quite a win-win for both sides.
Right. And this bit about UK companies being treated as class 2 suppliers, would you explain that to me a little bit? Is that significant? Of course, the caveat being that 20% of their product or services.
Yes, 20% of their products and services can be from the UK. So this again brings us back to that localization agenda, because the moment you're saying 20% of your services can be or products can be from the UK, which means the balance then has to be supplied from India, which means either you form a consortium or a JV, you come in with an Indian player, or you do some level of localization.
Now, the deal also includes a dedicated SME chapter promoting collaboration, trade facilitation, and capacity building. I find this really interesting. What are your thoughts?
So, just to give you a sense, MSMEs contribute 30% to our GDP and account to 45% of our exports and employ somewhere around 160 million people. So MSMEs are a very significant part of our economy. In fact, if you recall, in the budget that we had in earlier this year in February, we actually took up the threshold levels for classification of an MSME. Micro went up to 2.5 crores, small to 25, and medium to about 125 crores. And this was largely done because, what people were doing just to stay below that threshold and to be able to claim, all the benefits of easier access to credit and a lot of the government, programs that are specifically tailored for MSMEs. People were not willing to invest, get more technology. So the government has already done that. That enabler is already in place. Your thresholds for being an MSME have significantly gone up. With the FTAs coming in, greater market access in the other economies. I think all this is going to have a very good multiplier effect because, like I said, MSMEs are great employers. So I see this as a very good, aspect that's going to come in for MSMEs. And I also picked up somewhere, Anirban, where it says that, while they will have access to our government procurement, which obviously the numbers are far more staggering than there will be in the UK, but our MSMEs will also have access to UK government's non-sensitive procurement. So, that's another area that's probably going to open out. We don't know what sort of really qualifies under non-sensitive procurement, but this is going to be another market that's going to open up for our MSMEs. So I see this as a very positive move.
So, coming to the Indian side, one thing that we've been really gunning for is something called Social Security Agreement. Why is this so significant? And do you see its inclusion as a major breakthrough?
So one, it's a major breakthrough, yes, because, this has been India's ask for a very long time. And this is actually something that NASSCOM has been pressing for a very long time because this impacts IT workers predominantly. Just to sort of step back for a moment and, give you a little bit of a background in terms of what is a social security agreement. This is essentially a protocol, just as we sign, double tax avoidance agreements with different countries to say if somebody's paid tax on a particular income in a particular country, then, the other country will give them credit for the taxes paid in the other country. So it's a bit like that, except this relates to your social security contributions. Now, typically what would happen, and mind you, India already has some 18, 19 SSAs. Oh? So we have them with, I think, if I remember correctly, Australia, US, Japan, France, Germany. So we have quite a few of these. So it's not a novel arrangement. It's just that we never had it with the UK. So essentially what this now allows you to do is that if somebody is a temporary worker in the UK, and we are describing temporary worker as somebody who's going to be there for less than 3 years, then they don't need to contribute to the social security requirements of the UK, so long as they're contributing to their social security commitments in India. So really speaking, what that would sort of translate into, if you're contributing your provident fund, which is your EPF in India, then you get what is called a certificate of coverage from the EPF authorities to say that you are contributing to your EPF here. And then you don't have to contribute to the social security in the UK. Now, in the past, when we didn't have this agreement, what would typically happen that, people wouldn't want a break in their PF in India, so they would continue to contribute here. And they would tell their employer, you take care of the UK one because I'm never going to avail the benefits of that contribution. If I'm going to be there for 2.5 years or whatever, I'm never really going to benefit. And in the UK, that's almost 20% of your salary. So it was a significant cost for the business. So I think it's just going to make it easier, because if the cost of talent goes down, the cost of doing business goes down. And, that's always a good thing. Of course, we'll have to see the fine print. They're not calling it a social security agreement. They're calling it the double contribution convention. But I think essentially it sort of augurs the similar kind of a regime where, you get benefit of the fact that you're subscribing to the social security in your home country, and therefore you don't need to do it in the country where you're working. So that's how this is going to progress. And I think it's a very good step.
But are there still some other challenges? This is obviously to, make worker mobility easier. But are there still challenges like uncertainty over visa regulations, etc., that should have been possibly part of the trade agreement and are not, and they're still to be ironed out?
So, there hasn't been much that has been said on the visas. In fact, one of the comments that they have made very emphatically, and I'm sure that's for their own home audience, is the fact that their immigration policy has not changed. So UK has this point system of immigration, and they have kind of reiterated in the public domain that, look, that doesn't stand changed. But I would imagine, Anirban, if they're saying that there's going to be easier access to talent on both sides and greater mobility, and both countries will process the visas more expeditiously, then I would imagine there will be some easing out of visas. I mean, honestly, I don't see that happening unless, there is a rethink on the visa scheme as well, in terms of how do you make it expedient for people to get the visas.
Pallavi, on that, I'd like to bring you to India's stance on investor-state dispute settlement, or ISDS. And its stance has been really tough in the last few years. Now, the UK has pushed for strong legal recourse for its companies, whereas India has resisted over sort of fears of regulatory overreach. Do you think they have reached a consensus?
I think this is a very important one because there's a lot of history to it. Usually, investor-state disputes are governed by something called a bilateral investment treaty. They're called BITs. And India actually is in the process of renegotiating their BIT, because after the Vodafone and Kane litigation, which are now pretty sort of well known and understood in the public domain, India did feel that, they did not exhaust all the legal remedies that were available to them before invoking international arbitration. And that continues to be India's stand even today. They don't want people, the moment there's, something doesn't go their way, they go and invoke an international arbitration. I mean, and this is also a way of asserting your own sovereignty as a country, to say that, look, you have to follow due process of law in our country. And even then, if there can't be a resolution, then we invoke the BIT. Obviously, UK has a very different look at it. They feel that our judicial system takes very long. Our, appellate process has so many levels, and it's just difficult to find resolution. And obviously, some of these disputes come in the way of business flourishing and doing well. So while I didn't see anything anywhere for India committing to any specific ISDS arrangement. But my sense and understanding is that the negotiation of the BIT with UK, the bilateral investment treaty, would probably work in parallel and in tandem with the FTA to ensure that, a lot of these commitments that you're making for, wanting more investment into India and, more trade between both the countries, then there will be something that they will do, I imagine, to make the process of arbitration or resolution simpler.
So, what about other problems that have been associated with India? I mean, allegedly, of course, by its trading partners. One of them is the high non-tariff barriers that it seems to be putting up with all trade agreements or trade, pacts. Other concerns, of course, like its stress on data localization. Do you think, in this case, at least with the UK, do you think they've been ironed out?
So, these are not new. They happen in every economy. If you look at it from India's perspective, even UK has non-trade barriers. I think sanitary and phytosanitary standards that they have is a classic example why, a lot of Indian agri products can't get into the UK. UK has very strict labeling requirements, which sometimes the cost of adhering to that can be quite prohibitive for businesses in India. So, and I admit, in India we have our own share. Our Bureau of Indian Standards and different rules around that keep changing. We have pricing control. Like we spoke a little earlier, there is always this local content requirements. These are all non-tariff barriers as far as trade is concerned. I clearly feel that if this FTA is to be a success, then a lot of these will have to be worked around, and I think some of them definitely will get watered down at both ends, or the other country will, bring their standards up to such an extent where, India starts meeting the standards of UK's sanitary and phytosanitary requirements. So I think there's going to be a mid path that's going to be arrived at to make sure that it doesn't really disrupt trade as it's expected to. I don't think they're all going to go away, but I think there'll be an improvement over where we are today. Let me put it that way.
Right. No, that's very well put. And finally, Pallavi, India is also in talks with the US for a bilateral trade deal. Now, the negotiations in scope are completely different when it comes to UK and US. But some of the critiques leveled at India as a trading partner are somewhat similar. For example, the fact that it's considered to be the 8th most restrictive services market in the world.
Yeah.
Do you think if this goes through, and this is not a legal document yet, and it hopefully will be, the India-UK trade agreement, if this goes through, can lessons from this agreement be used to make sure that other negotiations, especially the imminent one with the US, fructify into a more mutually beneficial trade setup?
One would love to believe that if we've just recently negotiated a trade agreement, one would be in a better position to negotiate another one with the US. But, it's important to understand the dynamics that we have with the US, which is actually quite different to what we have with the UK.
Sure.
I think our trade with the UK is somewhere around 42.8 or 43 billion pounds. With the US, it is $118.2 billion. And this is a trade, where the trade surplus is on India's side. We have, I don't remember the exact number, but somewhere around 38 billion surplus. So we have a lot to lose if we don't get this right, Whereas the current FTA with UK is more forward-looking in terms of, how it gives us more market access. But the US one is, according to me, a little more sensitive because the numbers are very different there.
Right.
In the India-UK FTA, we're talking about, touching 100 billion in 2030 or maybe even later. Here we're talking about a business which is already $118 billion. So I think this will require a lot more finesse in negotiating. And I think the endeavor here needs to be more around having a more balanced trade agreement. To that extent, I feel, why we will have to settle for tariff reduction. And you rightly said, India's, I think, 8th in the OECD list of tariff country with maximum tariff barriers. So I think somewhere that needs to change. And I think India's realized it. We are in great shape as an economy. We've only done well. Our businesses have become more competitive globally. And I think the same is going to happen with all these FTAs. And if you look at at least look at the India FTA, it's not as if it's happening tomorrow. Everything is happening over a 10-year horizon. So it's not as if your tariff barriers are coming down immediately. They are graded, So I think it's giving everybody enough time to, pull your socks up and, become a global player and have that competitive edge. So you can thrive in a larger economy rather than, wanting to be insulated.
Understood. On that note, we'll wind up our conversation. Thank you so much, Pallavi, for joining us on the Morning Brief.
Thank you, Anirban. Been a pleasure talking to you.
That's it for today. You were listening to this episode on the Morning Brief. It was produced by me and Radhas Naik, sound designed by Indranil Bhattacharjee. A new episode of TMB drops every Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday, wherever you get your podcasts. Keep listening. Have a good weekend.